This is the Minecraft Construction Handbook. Published over a decade ago now, this book was a huge part of Minecraft's history. But that's exactly what it is now, history. So I've made it my mission to try and upgrade as much of the book as I can, bringing the builds up to a more modern standard while keeping the rough feel of the original builds. So far, we've upgraded 2 of the 7 builds detailed in the book, and today we're going to take a look at another, the floating castle. Now, while I quite like the island's shape, the rest of the castle is, well, not it. I think the part that bugs me the most is that for a castle, these walls are surprisingly thin. And hey, even calling it a castle is a stretch. It's a glorified courtyard. This is gonna need some work, so let's get started on it. First, we're going to start off by building a 1x1 pillar as high as we want the island to be, though I wouldn't recommend building to build height, otherwise you're going to struggle to put anything on top of your island. Next, we'll build out roughly 15 blocks in each direction from the pillar. You can change this depending on how big you want your island to be, but I'll be sticking with 15 for this build. Now, once you have your 4 points, you'll want to connect each of them up. This doesn't have to be a perfect circle. In fact, the more rough it looks, the better. Next, we'll want to connect the same 4 points diagonally down into the middle pillar. Once again, randomness is your friend here, as it will look more natural. Now, to finish off the island structure, we'll start by filling in the gaps of the island. We can do this by making more rings around the center pillar, getting somewhat smaller each time to roughly match the slope the island should have, eventually ending it in one sharp peak. Now, those of you who've read the book might have noticed I've actually been building the island exactly as the book describes it. Yet that kind of seems silly considering we're supposed to be upgrading this build, but honestly, the way they made the island is surprisingly really good. The only thing I can think of improving on it is to add texture to the stone, which I forgot to do while building this. Oops. Moving quickly on, we need to give this island a ground for our castle to stand on. So we're going to quickly layer off the top of the island and lay down a layer of grass blocks, just like in the book. But this is where the similarities between the book and I's builds end, as we're going to give the flat edges of the island a little more depth. In order to do this, we're going to start by building out an extra layer of grass to cover the stone sides, slightly dipping down on either side, almost as if gravity is trying to pull it down. Then we'll fill in the middle of it and add a random length of dirt trailing down to further simulate that feeling of gravity. We can then repeat this pattern all the way around the island, varying the sizes and lengths of the outcrops to make it feel a little less man-made, which, when it comes to terraforming like this, can be rather difficult. But I found this style to be nice and reliable for me. But you know what isn't reliable? My upload schedule. So, if you like my builds and want to see more, make sure to scroll down and check your subscribe so you don't actually miss when I upload the next one. Back on topic, we'll add another layer of grass on top to make it look a little less flat, finishing off the island itself. Now, onto the main build, the castle. Like with most builds, we'll start by outlining the shape of the castle, then raising it up to the desired wall height. With this build, I decided to make the walls a bit thicker so that we could add an interior to them later, whilst also boosting the security of the castle. I also decided to square off the towers rather than keep them roughly circular like in the original build. That way it'll be easier to add detail to them later down the line. Next, we'll build up the 4 corner towers until we get to a height that we're happy with. We'll leave the tops for now and come back to them later. Now, before we move on, I want to discuss a technique that you can use to make your builds pop out a little bit more. Take this wall for instance. At the minute, it looks pretty plain and boring, right? Okay then, let's try adding some different blocks in, see if that will make a difference. Okay, that looks a little better, but it still looks really flat. You know what? Let's pull out that spruce wood block, give the wall some depth. Okay, that looks better, right? And hey, now we have some space to add some detailing in front of the wall to make it pop out even more. Pretty cool, right? Now, let's do something similar with the castle. Starting with the front gate, we're going to build up 2 andesite pillars either side of the gateway, rounding off the corners with some stairs. Next, we'll replace the corners of each tower with doubled up andesite block. And look, I know I just said about using depth in builds, but we'll tackle that later when we detail the towers, okay? Just trust the process. Moving back to the front gate, we can then start adding a trim to the top of the walls. For this, I'm using one of my favorite patterns, which I like to call the chain, alternating between upside down and right side up andesite stairs, stopping briefly with a ring of andesite around the middle of the tower, continuing along the flat wall. Then we can repeat this all around the castle until we get back to the gate. Now, just like any good castle, we'll need some crenellations. And if you're wondering just what on earth I'm on about, these are the pointy bits you'll see at the top of castle walls, something the original build actually did have. We'll use andesite stairs for these, adding them on top of the outer wall trim, then applying a similar trim to the inner wall and adding crenellations to that too. Next, we'll tackle the tops of the towers. Personally, I wasn't a fan of the roof design of the originals, so I decided to make it a bit more castle-y and similar to the rest of the build, this time using full blocks rather than stairs for the crenellations to give it a more solid feel. We can finish it off with a wooden floor and start working on detailing the tower. We'll start off by adding 2 pillars of stone brick either side of the central strip, filling in the middle with some andesite stairs to add some depth. We can then repeat this on the outer walls of the tower, leaving a gap for some lookout windows, something I think the original really did lack. Moving down to the base of the tower, rather than some solid stone brick pillars, we'll experiment with some stone brick stairs, making an almost snake-like pattern with the block. We can then add in some more andesite stairs up the middle, mixing in some slabs in the window spaces to offset the window space, and mirroring it on the other wall to finish the tower off. And now we can repeat it across the other towers. Now, while I get on with that, if you're enjoying this build and want to use it or build it yourself, I'll be putting a schematic of it for free in my Discord, link in the description. Same goes for the previous builds in this series and even notable stuff from my other videos. Again, the link will be in the description, and let's get back to the build. Next up, we can add a quick line of andesite along the walkways. Not for any particular reason, I just thought it looked nice. And while we're on it, we can quickly fill in the gateway with some more andesite to connect it to the outside wall and make it feel a bit more solid. Now, onto detailing these walls. We'll start by adding some alternating andesite stairs going down the middle of the section, leaving the central block blank to hang a lantern in. We can then add in some andesite walls to the corner of the tower, following up with fences and a chain to make an uneven pillar. Then we'll add it to the other side to finish off that section and mirror it on the section opposite the gateway. Finally, deal with that gap I missed earlier in the video. Once we finish that, we can then repeat the corner pillars on all the other corners of the towers. See, I told you we'd tackle the depth on the tower later. See, now this is one of my favorite things about building with non-full blocks like walls and chains, is it means we can get smoother corners, making these towers feel a lot more rounded, which, as we all know, is pretty difficult to achieve in Minecraft. Next, we'll add some spruce trapdoors around the center rings of the towers, just to give it a little bit more depth. And while we're up here, we'll finish off the walkways by adding some chains between the crenellations to act as little railings. Admittedly, these railings are pretty ineffective, seeing as you can just walk up sideways chains. Honestly, who cares about OSHA violations when it can actually make your build look a lot better? Jokes aside, I just really like how it lines up with the middle of the stairs. It's just really satisfying to me. Anyway, we'll add the railings to the top of each tower, quickly filling in the wood floor I somehow missed earlier, and finally finishing off these towers. Now we'll move down to the main walls. We'll start off with the chain pattern once again, this time at the base of the wall, adding slabs on the top of the upright stairs to complete that chain look, and doing exactly the same but in reverse on the top. We'll then fill in the top gaps with andesite walls, adding in fences in the corners by each bit of andesite, filling them in with chains and mirroring it on both sides. Next, we'll add a fence under the central wall and attach 2 fence gates either side, opening them, giving this cool effect of a gap that isn't technically there. We'll do the same on the other side, hanging lanterns off the central fences. Then we can go around the outside of the castle, repeating this on the remaining outer walls. Now, before we move on to the inner walls, we'll need to add a portcullis to this castle. This time we're going to double it up and leave it open, unlike the OG build. I'm still not sure how they actually expected you to get inside the original, considering it was permanently closed. Moving on though. The inside walls won't be much different to the outside. We'll once again start with the chain pattern going along the bottom of the wall, this time adding sideways stairs on top of the upside down stairs. Now, I was tempted to use the wall fence chain design here like I did on the outer walls, but with only 4 blocks of space, it just wouldn't have worked. So I decided to work with the space I did have and be a bit more experimental with the shapes in these sections. Next, we'll go ahead and add some slabs to the upper trim of the walls, once again completing the chain pattern and giving the sections an almost shield-like shape. We'll then follow up by adding some entranceways to the walls, making one for each section and topping them off with a slab. We'll then add andesite walls and spruce fences either side of the entranceways, hanging lanterns from each fence, and in the sections with no doors, we can do a gate-fence-gate combo with a lantern, repeating these for each section. And with that, we can finally move on to the interior. We'll start off by laying down an andesite floor in one of the entranceways by the gate, and quickly bringing the wall a bit closer to the entrance. Then creating a small step up to the floor of the tower, which will be 1 block higher to be at the same height as the windows. We'll then add in the second floor at the same height as the walkways, leaving a gap for a ladder later on. We can then move on to the next hallway, which will slightly dip back down so it matches the height of the entrance. We'll then create a strip of andesite right by the entrance, and connect it to the andesite on the tower edges. We can then repeat this for the rest of the inner wall, adding a layer of slabs to the ceiling to make the upper andesite trim a bit more subtle. I then had to go back and do that for the rest of the hallways because somehow I forgot to do it. I even forgot to give some of the towers a second floor. So I added those in as well and went back to the last tower to finish it off. Next, we'll add some small peak holes throughout the corridors of the walls, using some stairs as the bottom blocks so that the person looking out has a much bigger field of vision and can see a bit more. Then we can finish off the walls by adding some ladders straight to the top of the towers. As for the courtyard, I was never really a fan of the wooden flooring, so I opted to switch it out here for a random mix of dirts. Now, one of the key details of building is making a place feel lived in. So I put a little pile of hay in one corner for some reason, and in the other corner I made a little gravel patch for where the castle smithing area will be. I then altered one of the sections to feature a fireplace, and after a minor fire mishap, I added in some workstations for someone to, well, work on. Finally, I extended the dirt section out the gate, making sure to use coarse dirt to stop the grass from sneaking in, and doing a lap with bone meal to finish off the island. And that about does it for the floating castle. Comparing it to the original build, it's definitely a little drastic looking at them side by side, but honestly, there really wasn't much to work with the original, so I don't really blame myself for going a little bit off path with it. Anyway, let me know what build you'd like to see tackled next in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed this upgrade.